The midday heat in Texas was the kind that clung to your skin like guilt, and Naomi Carter stood beneath it in a training yard so wide and barren it could have swallowed her whole, her shirt damp from drills, her breathing measured, her silence mistaken once again for weakness. They had been watching her since morning, watching her move through obstacle courses with quiet precision, watching her eat alone at the edge of the mess tent, watching her tie her scuffed boots with fingers that never trembled, and most of all, watching with eyes sharpened by contempt that had little to do with her actions and everything to do with who they thought she was. The voice that cut across the yard came from Sergeant Blake, a man with a jaw like a padlock and a temper sharpened by years of command. He had seen her hesitate for a second during a simulated takedown, and that was all the permission he needed to ridicule her publicly, to unearth the tension that had been fermenting quietly among the recruits. "Carter!" he barked, his boots pounding toward her like accusations. "You think this is a fashion show? You think you can hide behind those worn-out sleeves and slip through our drills like some charity case?" Naomi didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on the distant tree line, as if beyond it lay something more deserving of her attention than the man whose rage now echoed off the gravel. "I said, take off that uniform, faker," Blake shouted, and with one violent pull he yanked the back of her shirt, the fabric tearing down her spine with a sound so raw it made even the cocky ones, Lance, Tara, Kyle, blink and go still. There was a beat of silence, just one breath, before someone snorted. "Figures. Probably got some boyfriend's name inked back there," Kyle muttered, his voice laced with the smugness of those who confuse cruelty with cleverness. But what the torn fabric revealed was not a name, nor a flower, nor anything sentimental. It was a coiled black widow spider, its legs knotted around a fractured skull, the ink faded but unmistakable in its detail. The tattoo was not just an image, it was a statement, a code, a whispered legacy. And when Colonel Whitmore, who had until then been leaning lazily against the edge of the obstacle wall with a clipboard in one hand and indifference in the other, caught sight of it, his entire posture changed. He straightened, not just his back but his face, which had gone pale beneath his sun-weathered skin. "Where did you get that mark?" he asked, his voice lower, stripped of all pretense. The yard was suddenly uncomfortably quiet. Naomi turned, her spine bare, the breeze pressing the ragged edges of her shirt against her ribs. She said nothing for a moment. Then, with a calm that made the questions sound irrelevant, she answered. "It was given to me, by Commander Hank Reyes. 6 years under his command." Colonel Whitmore froze. His hand moved slowly, almost reverently, to his brow, and he saluted her. Not out of protocol, but out of something older, something heavier. Recognition. The cadets around them had not moved. Their laughter had evaporated. Their eyes flicked from the tattoo to the colonel's face. And in that suspended silence, the power dynamics they had clung to so comfortably cracked. Not with a crash, but with a shift so deep it would echo long after the yard was empty. Naomi Carter arrived at Fort Ralston in a rust-bucket pickup whose rear-view mirror dangled like a loose tooth and whose engine coughed more than it roared. And while most recruits came dragging oversized duffels and grins plastered with adrenaline, she stepped down with a single worn backpack slung over one shoulder and a stillness that unsettled more than it invited. There was something in the way she moved that contradicted her appearance. Her clothes hung loose, faded by sun and repeated washing, her boots scuffed at the toes and heels, and her hair tucked low into a tight coil at the nape of her neck, like she couldn't be bothered to present it any other way. But her eyes were alert in a way that made seasoned instructors glance twice and not know why. She didn't speak unless addressed. She didn't fidget or posture like the others. She listened, she observed. She stood like a woman used to being underestimated and trained not to mind. Rumor among the recruits had it that she was from somewhere down in rural Georgia. Backwoods, maybe Appalachia, maybe the kind of place where the post office still shared space with the general store. But no one could quite pin her down, and that ambiguity only added to their unease. People like Naomi weren't supposed to slip into elite federal military joint boot camps. People like Naomi were supposed to take tickets at gas stations, fold linens at motels, or vanish into the nameless gaps of small towns. She didn't tell them her father had been a judge or that her mother had taught at Howard University. She didn't talk about the estate in Maryland, with the wraparound porch and the kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and cedar. Naomi had chosen to arrive without that narrative, had peeled it off like skin she no longer wore. She wasn't here to prove a legacy, she was here to earn one. From the very first briefing, her presence was met with glances that started at her boots and ended in smirks. Captain Sanders had looked up from the roster, squinted at her like she was a typo, and said, "You're Carter?" as if the name should have come with someone taller, fairer, louder. She'd only nodded, offering no correction, no explanation. It wasn't just the men who questioned her. The women too, especially the polished ones. Tara Montgomery, with her high ponytail and polished nails that somehow survived the mud, eyed Naomi as a threat not to their ranks, but to their idea of who belonged. Tara had whispered to another, "Quota pick," and Naomi had heard it, tucked it away like a stone in her pocket, not heavy enough to burden her, but sharp enough to remember. At chow, Naomi sat alone, not out of defiance, but from habit. She ate slowly with the kind of composure that made her seem immune to the cafeteria chaos, the boys throwing peas like grenades, the girls shouting over the din of metal trays. And when asked why she didn't join them, she said only, "I like quiet," as if that were a reason people still understood. She was a ghost to them. Not invisible, but incomprehensible. The kind of person who made you aware of your own noise, your own need to fill silences with opinions, your own discomfort in the face of restraint. Yet even those who laughed at her, who mocked the frayed collar of her shirt and the calm in her voice, would later say, with something like reverence or regret, there was always something about her. Not a threat, not arrogance, just something. Naomi Carter didn't carry herself like someone seeking approval. She carried herself like someone who'd already survived the worst thing that could be done to her, and wasn't about to offer explanations to anyone. The first time Naomi was pushed wasn't during a sparring drill or a mock assault. It was during breakfast, when the tray line was long and patience thin, and Derek Vaughn, a stocky recruit with the smirk of someone who believed he'd already earned a future rank, stepped ahead of her as if she hadn't been there at all. His elbow grazing her side not by accident, but by intention. She said nothing, only steadied her balance and resumed her place behind him, though her silence seemed to irritate him more than protest ever could, and he turned, eyeing her from boot to brow with the kind of curiosity that isn't about knowing but belittling. "You from logistics or what?" he asked, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. "They letting supply runners into boot camp now?" Someone snorted, another murmured, "Maybe she's here to audit." Naomi kept her gaze on the tray rail, her hands folded in front of her like she was waiting on something far more important than scrambled eggs and ridicule. It wasn't just the cafeteria. In the locker rooms she found her towel soaked and tossed to the floor more than once. On the training grounds her name was pronounced with sarcasm and followed by chuckles that carried nothing humorous, just the steady beat of disdain masked as banter. Tara, polished and perfect in her regulation gear, had leaned over during weapons inspection and whispered, "Careful with the safety switch, Carter. Wouldn't want you shooting yourself trying to hold the rifle." Naomi had looked at her, not with anger but with the same look she might give a cracked compass. Not broken enough to matter, but too flawed to be trusted. They didn't just question her strength. They questioned her right to exist within that space. When she bent to tie her bootlaces, frayed and unraveling, Lance called out, "Hey, Goodwill, you want us to chip in for new shoes or you saving that paycheck for something shinier?" The others laughed, grateful he'd said it first, relieved to be on the side of ridicule rather than risk being mistaken for the outlier. Naomi didn't respond. She tied the laces tight, double-knotted, and rose to her feet with that quiet weight she always carried. A silence that unsettled more than shouting ever could. Even the instructors weren't immune. Sergeant Blake once walked past during a push-up set, paused over Naomi's form and muttered, "Your arms look like they came out of a library." Another instructor chuckled, or a poetry slam. The cruelty wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came in glances held too long, conversations that stopped when she entered a room, or group assignments suddenly reshuffled to make sure she wasn't included. She noticed, of course. She noticed everything. But noticing isn't the same as reacting, and Naomi Carter had long since learned the difference between being silent and being silent with purpose. In one navigation drill through the woods, Kyle tore her map in half under the pretense of a joke, letting the scraps flutter like broken birds through the trees. "You'll find your way back, right?" he sneered, certain she'd panic, certain this was the moment her mask would crack. She didn't. She walked, eyes on the horizon, trusting the terrain, trusting something deeper than coordinates, something like instinct or memory, or maybe just grit, pressed hard into bone. Behind her they watched, their laughter strained now, stretched too thin, because there was something they couldn't explain about the way she didn't break, not when mocked, not when shoved, not even when denied food and forced to drink only water while others stuffed their plates with seconds. And that refusal to be broken, to even acknowledge the attempt, made them hate her more. It began with the rifle. During the weapons maintenance drill, while others cursed over stubborn pins and fumbled bolts with hands too jittery to trust, Naomi sat cross-legged on the gravel, the parts of her M4 laid out before her like puzzle pieces she'd memorized in another life, her fingers moving not with speed but with a clarity that made speed irrelevant. No hesitation, no wasted motion, just a sequence performed so flawlessly the instructor paused mid-step, eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in confusion, as if he were watching someone play a song they hadn't heard in decades yet still knew the words to. 52 seconds, he said, more to himself than anyone else, his stopwatch still running, forgotten in his hand. The others scoffed, but it was a quiet, nervous kind of scoffing, the kind that comes not from disbelief but from the uneasy feeling of witnessing something outside your understanding. Lance muttered, "So she can take apart a toy. Doesn't mean she can fight," but even he didn't sound as sure anymore. Later that day, in the woods during a navigation challenge, Alina, a quiet girl who had never laughed at Naomi but never defended her either, slipped something into her hand when no one was looking. A spare map, carefully folded, corners creased like a secret. "You'll need it," she whispered, not because Naomi looked lost, but because she didn't. And that was beginning to unsettle people in a different way. Naomi said nothing, just nodded once in acknowledgement, tucking the map into her waistband without ceremony. The next drill, long-range shooting, was supposed to separate those who belonged from those who'd wandered in by mistake, and Tara made sure to lean over before Naomi's turn, whispering, "Bet she can't even hold the recoil," loud enough to echo past the barricades. But Naomi didn't respond. She knelt at the mark, adjusted nothing on the scope, and fired 5 shots in steady rhythm. 5 hits, 5 bullseyes. And when the range officer checked the rifle afterward, he found the sight misaligned by half a degree. She had compensated without so much as a blink. That evening, word passed through the barracks like smoke. Carter can shoot, Carter can move, Carter doesn't shake. Still, the disbelief lingered, not from Naomi's actions but from the dissonance they caused. Because people like her, quiet, brown-skinned, threadbare, weren't supposed to do things flawlessly. They weren't supposed to endure without flinching or succeed without boasting. They weren't supposed to be better than the rest without making noise about it. But Naomi never did. She just kept moving forward, her hands steady, her eyes clear. And for the first time when she passed by, someone didn't laugh. They looked. The final drill of the week was a combat simulation. No weapons, just hands, instinct, and whatever muscle memory the recruits had managed to carve into their bones. Pairs were called to the center of the ring one by one, cheered or mocked depending on which side of the camp's invisible line they stood on. When Naomi's name was called, the laughter came fast, familiar. Loudest among them was Lance, of course, already cracking his knuckles like victory was a formality and not a question. She stepped forward, her shirt damp from the day's heat, her breath even, her face unreadable. She didn't flinch when Lance leaned in and muttered, "This won't take long." Didn't blink when he grabbed her collar and shoved her back hard enough to tear the fabric, the rip loud and careless, like he'd meant to do it all along. But then the yard fell silent. Not because of the force of the shove or the violence of the gesture, but because of what the torn shirt revealed. Across the upper sweep of Naomi's back, just below the line of her shoulder blades, lay a tattoo, a widow's spider, its legs wrapped tight around the fractured remnants of a skull, inked in black so deep it seemed to drink the sun. It was faded but unmistakable, and terrifying. Colonel Whitmore, who had been watching from the edge of the field with the bored posture of a man who thought he had seen everything, froze mid-step. His face paled, not from fear but recognition, the kind that reaches into your memory and knocks something loose. "Who gave you that mark?" he asked, his voice stripped of command, low and almost reverent. Naomi stood, her back straight, the shredded shirt falling loosely around her ribs, and for the first time since her arrival, she spoke with something other than quiet. "Commander Hank Reyes," she said, "Black Widow Division, 6 years." The name was like a dropped grenade. No flash, no sound, but every face on that field changed. A few of the instructors, older ones with scars you couldn't see, exchanged glances that didn't need explanation. One recruit whispered, "That's classified." Another mouthed the words, "No way," over and over, as if disbelief could rewrite what they were seeing. Colonel Whitmore stepped forward, slow, his hand rising to his forehead, not as a gesture of rank, but of respect, of correction, of something like apology. "Stand down," he said to Lance, who was still frozen, one hand half clenched. "Immediately." Lance backed away like he'd touched something sacred and didn't know how to explain the burn. And for the first time, no one looked at Naomi with smirks or squints or half-hidden grins. They looked like people who had just realized they'd spent the week laughing at a fire they didn't know was lit. After the salute fell and the whispers bloomed like weeds in the silence, Naomi pulled the shredded flap of her shirt across her back, fingers calm, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. No revelation, no shift in gravity, no colonel's salute delivered to a woman they had mocked for her boots, her silence, her skin. She didn't glare at Lance, didn't confront Tara, didn't demand apology or acknowledgement. Instead, she moved past them like fog through a forest, gentle, unbothered, but impossible to ignore. There was power in that choice, the kind that didn't need revenge to feel whole, the kind that made people question not just their words, but the ease with which they'd delivered them. The next day she was handed a new assignment slip in silence, honorary combat instructor, effective immediately. And though the instructors offered it with stiff posture and carefully neutral expressions, they could not disguise the way their eyes avoided hers for a breath too long. She accepted without ceremony, tucking the paper into her bag without comment. She did not celebrate. She simply showed up to the training yard 20 minutes early, a fresh black t-shirt stretched across her shoulders, the widow's spider hidden again. When she began to demonstrate close-quarters techniques, silent takedowns, joint locks, redirection of force, the cadets, even the most cynical, stood straighter. Not because she demanded it, but because watching her move was like watching water find every weakness in a stone wall. She flowed, and the wall fell. Tara, arms crossed and jaw tight, leaned against the fence, as if refusing to watch was some small protest she could still afford. But when Naomi paired her with Derek for a pressure bandage drill and watched, saying nothing as Derek fumbled again, it was Tara who, cheeks flushed with reluctant realization, stepped in and finished the rap with quiet competence. Naomi nodded once, that was all. Later, in the break room, someone had left a cup of coffee on her cot. Lukewarm, no note, sugar already stirred in. She didn't drink it, but she also didn't discard it. Some apologies, she seemed to understand, were quieter than others. And when asked, days later by Captain Harris, one of the few who'd never spoken her name until now, why she hadn't filed any complaints, hadn't demanded formal inquiry, hadn't written names, Naomi paused only a moment before saying, "Because none of that teaches them what they really needed to learn." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. When Naomi Carter left Fort Ralston, it wasn't with a speech or a salute or even a glance over her shoulder. Just her single backpack slung over one arm, the frayed strap stitched recently with someone else's thread, and the battered pickup rattling to life like it had been waiting for her to return and not the other way around. No one stopped her. No one dared. They simply watched, scattered across the training yard in ones and twos, their feet still, their mouths unsure, their eyes filled not with grief or guilt, but with something quieter and heavier. Recognition, maybe. Or a memory already taking root? Tara didn't wave. She stood at the edge of the barracks, her arms crossed, the way she had always stood. But her eyes didn't harden this time. They softened, just a little, the way dry ground does when touched by rain that won't stay. Lance was gone by then. Reassigned, they said, to a desk in Kansas, though no one said it aloud with pride. His absence lingered like dust after boots have moved on. The instructors spoke less in drills, they measured more, barked less. Even Captain Harris, who had once sneered at Naomi's silence, now paused longer before correcting a recruit, as if measuring tone mattered more than tone itself. And in the quiet evenings, by the flicker of mess hall lights, recruits who had once laughed the loudest now whispered her name in careful tones. Not with reverence, but with understanding. The way you speak of someone who didn't raise her voice, but still managed to be heard. One afternoon, a cadet named Elena found a photograph tucked beneath her bunk's mattress. It was old, creased, the edges worn soft with years. It showed Naomi, younger, her arm around a man whose face was partially turned, wearing a black tactical jacket with no insignia. Written on the back in careful pen was a single phrase. "This isn't a badge, it's a promise." Elena didn't say anything. She slipped the photo into her pocket and carried it like a talisman, not because she needed proof of Naomi's story, but because part of her wanted to remember that such stories existed. Outside the camp, Naomi's name drifted through the veteran community like a wind with no source. Some said she was working with federal training units in undisclosed locations. Others claimed she'd vanished into the quiet, living somewhere near the border where people respected silence more than sound. But those who had trained with her never forgot. Not her quiet, not her gaze, not the weight she carried with grace so complete it looked like peace. And in the homes of older Americans, those who had lived through segregation, through wars, through decades of being misunderstood, her story arrived not as a headline, but as a whisper, passed from porch to porch, church pew to church pew, in voices softened by years. Did you hear about the black woman with the tattoo? The one who didn't say much but changed everything? They listened. Because they too had been Naomi once.